How do you respond when someone says, "But Frank, the Bible endorses slavery"?
All right, let's see it.
I would say, first of all, what do you mean by slavery? Do you know what the kind of slavery the Old Testament was talking about?
Yeah, do you?
Because it's not the kind of race-based chattel slavery we had here in America.
So Frank here is being wildly misleading by suggesting that biblical slavery was unlike American slavery because American slavery was race-based chattel slavery. The Bible describes debt slavery, but it also quite explicitly describes and endorses chattel slavery. You can look in Leviticus 25. There are chattel slaves described as the property of the people who have purchased them. They are explicitly distinguished from the debt slaves. Leviticus 25 takes several verses to explain that you will not submit native-born Israelites to chattel slavery, but the foreign-born, or those born in Israel of foreign families, can be bought, sold, passed on as inheritance and as property. That is explicitly describing chattel slavery. So while there is non-chattel slavery in the Bible, there is also absolutely, indisputably, chattel slavery in the Bible. Now, the other feature, race-based, that's problematic for the Bible because the notion of race as a question of skin color did not exist until European Christians invented it in the medieval period in order to facilitate their imperialism and their structuring of power. And in the Bible, the words that we now translate race generally referred to national identity, linguistic identity, ethnic identity. And as we see in Leviticus 25, it is quite explicitly ethnically based. It is not for Israelites, it is for non-Israelites. In other words, the chattel slavery of the Bible is ethnically based because they had no concept of race as a question of skin color. It was primarily a question of ethnicity, and that was what determined whether or not someone could be subjected to the chattel slavery that is quite explicitly endorsed in the Hebrew Bible.
Which actually is prohibited.
Yes.
Kidnapping for slavery was...
in both the Old and New Testaments,
correct.
It was punishable by death in the Old Testament, okay?
So this is false and also misleading. It's false because there's absolutely no sense whatsoever in which the prohibition on kidnapping functions as a prohibition on chattel slavery. All nations in the ancient world and the modern world that allowed chattel slavery had prohibitions on kidnapping certain people. Kidnapping was not the only or even a main means of sourcing enslaved folks for chattel slavery. The three main means of sourcing were the slave trade, conquest, and breeding. And that has always been more or less the same when we look at the ancient world or even pre-Civil War American slavery. Additionally, Exodus 21:16 is not prohibiting the kidnapping of any and all peoples anywhere and everywhere. It quite clearly is prohibiting the kidnapping of freeborn adult male Israelites. And this fits with not only Deuteronomy 24:7, which even more explicitly says this is about adult male Israelites, but that fits the prohibitions on kidnapping that we find in the laws of Hammurabi and in the societies around ancient Israel that also had chattel slavery as well as prohibitions on kidnapping, because the covenant code uses very technical terminology. Whether it's referring to perpetrators or victims, when it wants to refer to freeborn adult male Israelites, it uses the word ish, which just means man, but was a term of art in the covenant code. When they wanted to refer to a woman, they said isha, which means woman. If they wanted to refer to children of freeborn adult Israelites, they said ben or bat of an ish or an isha. When they wanted to refer to foreigners, they had a word for foreigner. When they wanted to refer to enslaved folks, they had a word for enslaved folks, because they all sat at different parts of this social hierarchy in the ancient world. And so punishments frequently differed based on the social status of the perpetrator or of the victims. And so Exodus 21:16 is a prohibition on kidnapping freeborn adult male Israelites, just like Deuteronomy 24:7, just like the laws of the nations around ancient Israel that prohibited kidnapping and also allowed for chattel slavery. In the New Testament, we're looking at 1 Timothy 1:10, where we've got what's called a vice list, which is where you just rattle off vices that are problematic. And there's a word there, andropolistes, which is sometimes translated kidnapper, but really only meant kidnapping in the generic sense in classical Greek, in more ancient Greek. In the Koine Greek of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, and by the way, most scholars agree that 1 Timothy was not written by Paul, but was written by someone pretending to be Paul, probably decades after his death at the end of the 1st century CE, or more likely, in my opinion, the beginning of the 2nd century CE. When we look at the Greek of that time period, that word quite explicitly referred to stealing another person's slave or kidnapping a free-born person in order to sell them into slavery. So it was not a prohibition on the slave trade in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. It was a prohibition on illegal slave trading, exactly as pretty much every society that has allowed chattel slavery has had. Even in the pre-Civil War American South, there were prohibitions on kidnapping certain types of people in order to sell them into slavery because they were people who were not legally subjectable to slavery, exactly as we see in Exodus 21:16.
It was chattel slavery. It was indentured servitude. If you were in debt and you needed to get out of debt and you needed to pay for your family, to feed your family, you could put yourself in an indentured servitude position to work for that person, to work off debt, and to provide for your family.
So this is something that Frank made up in order to make it sound like debt slavery was a social safety net that had as its main priority the well-being of the person who has fallen into destitution and sold themselves or someone else into debt slavery. And that is a grotesque misrepresentation of the status and the treatment of debt slaves as we find in the Hebrew Bible. Now, one thing to point out is that Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus say very, very different things about the treatment and the status of debt slaves. They contradict each other. For instance, in Exodus 21, the male debt slave serves for 6 years and goes free in the 7th. The female debt slave, who doesn't have debt of her own that would result in her selling herself into debt slavery, she would be sold into debt slavery by her father so that her father could get the money. And she's basically a sex slave, and she does not go free, ever. She is a permanent slave, and she can even be sold to other Israelites. Now, when we go look in Deuteronomy, it says that the male and the female debt slaves go free in the 7th year. And then when we look in Leviticus, it says they go free in the Jubilee year, which took place every 49 years. So if you sold yourself into debt slavery the year after a Jubilee year, you had decades of debt slavery ahead of you. If you sold yourself into debt slavery the year before the Jubilee year, if there was a market for debt slaves in that year, then you only had a little bit of time ahead of you. Now, Leviticus 25 tries to urge Israelites to not mistreat their fellow Israelites, their debt slaves. But when we look in the Covenant Code, Exodus 21, we see that a lot of the treatment of chattel slaves overlaps with the way debt slaves are treated. For instance, there's the part where it says if a man beats his slave with a staff and the slave immediately dies, the slave will be avenged. Now, it doesn't prescribe a specific punishment, and most scholars agree this is likely because it would depend on whether or not that slave who had been killed was a native-born Israelite or was a foreigner, because the punishment for a native-born Israelite would have been harsher than the punishment for a foreigner. But that is including the debt slave in that. And then the text says if the slave dies after a day or two, meaning they survive for a couple of days and then die, there's no punishment at all. So even if you were a native-born Israelite male who sold yourself into debt slavery and were looking forward to getting out in 7 years, you could potentially be beaten to death and your master could entirely escape any and all punishment. And the reason is because that enslaved person is their money or their property. In other words, they have lost their property. That's punishment enough. And if a man came into debt slavery, his master could breed additional enslaved people with him could give him a wife, and then any children that he had while serving as a debt slave remained with the master, as did the wife. If the man brought his wife with him, then she would have served as a debt slave alongside him. It's not like the master would have been, yeah, I'll take on these additional mouths to feed. They can go frolic in the yard, and they can braid each other's hair while you and I are working. No, they would have put them to work too, because they were debt slaves as well. The people subordinated to the debt slave socially don't have more rights than the debt slave to whom they are subordinated. So the notion this is all some kind of social safety net system is a laughable misrepresentation of the debt slavery of ancient Israel, which again is represented in different contradictory ways depending on which text we are looking at. And this raises another important point we should always keep in mind when talking about this. Most scholars don't think that any of this legislation was ever actually enforced in ancient Israel. Now, it's not to say that none of the specific individual laws were ever enforced, but the covenant code was unlikely to ever actually have operated as the on-the-ground jurisprudence. Same is true of Deuteronomy 15, same is true of Leviticus 25. This was propaganda. These were scribal exercises. Think of the 10 Commandments on display outside of a courtroom. In that courtroom, those 10 Commandments have absolutely no authority whatsoever. There is overlap with what is authoritative and what is in the 10 Commandments, but that's incidental because the 10 Commandments themselves exercise absolutely no authority within U.S. courtrooms. What is put on display is propaganda. And most scholars agree, based on comparison with the law codes of other nations from which Israel is borrowing, most of what they're saying in their own law codes is all propaganda. It is unlikely to have ever actually had any authority or been enforced in the courtrooms. So that is something that we need to keep in mind, not only as we note the contradictions between them, but as we talk about comparing what's going on in ancient Israel to what's going on in the pre-Civil War American South, where we overwhelmingly only hear about what actually happened on the ground and are not aware of what may have been on the books. In the Bible, all we have is what was probably not on the books, and we can't really reconstruct what actually happened on the ground. So it's an apples to oranges comparison in that sense to begin with, but Frank and Charlie are also wildly misrepresenting what is actually in the Bible.
And if you were in that situation, it was temporary. It could only go 7 years. Unless by mutual agreement you wanted to become a bondservant, you could extend that.
This also glosses over a lot of the differences between the different laws in order to reduce it all to one falsehood to make it sound a lot more like a social safety net rather than what it actually was. Because again, covenant code, it's only temporary for men. 7th year they go free. Women, it's permanent. Leviticus, it's however many years remain until the next Jubilee year. Deuteronomy 15, men and women go free in the 7th year. But what about children who are taken in order to pay the debts of the parents? 2 Kings 4, we have the widow who comes to Elisha and says, my husband has died. Creditors are coming to take my 2 children as slaves. There's absolutely nothing that indicates children who are taken in order to cover debts in order to serve as debt slaves were going to go free at any point in the future, which again brings up the question of the relationship between the legislation we have in Exodus, in Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, and what actually happened on the ground. If 2 Kings 4 is an accurate reflection of what was actually going on the ground, it sounds like debt slavery was going to be a lot more harsh and a lot more permanent than the authors of those pieces of legislation may have wanted us to be aware.
It wasn't race-based. You could get out of it by running away. You could leave it. This is in Deuteronomy 15. Deuteronomy 15, 14 to 16.
You're not to chase after your runaway slave
Yes,
or something.
you could. So it's not like chattel slavery here.
No, it is Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16, and the scholarly consensus is that this passage is addressing what to do if a foreign slave runs away from a foreign master and enters into Israel. the statement that you'll give them a place to stay from among the cities that are in you, is widely agreed by scholars to indicate that this is not someone living in Israel. This is someone coming from outside of Israel into Israel. So this law is more about sticking it to other nations by saying, we're going to keep your runaway slaves, ha ha, than it is about saying, if you don't like your slave master, you can just run away and they're not allowed to come get you. That's asinine. That's definitely not what was going on in the system of slavery that operated within ancient Israel and Judah.
It was not an ideal situation, but there was no welfare state in ancient Israel. There was no way to pay off debt other than put yourself in the employ of somebody else.
This is not true. There are a number of passages in the legislative layers of the Hebrew Bible that mandate what we could call a welfare state. For instance, the gleaning laws that you have in Leviticus and elsewhere, the tax-free loans that were required to be given to Israelites who were poor. You have debt release on the sabbatical year. You had debt release on the Jubilee year. You had care for the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. There are a number of ways that the legislation of the Hebrew Bible demands and provides for the care and feeding of the poor and the downtrodden.
In fact, it's a version of Old Testament. The Old Testament slavery or indentured servitude was really a kind of bankruptcy law. It allowed you to work off debt and take care of your family. And so it wasn't the kind of slavery we had here. It was indentured servitude. And there's a lot of details on this. My friend Paul Copan, who wrote a great book called Is God a Moral Monster?
I know. It's on my list.
Paul goes into it in great detail.
Copan's book is full of stock apologetic nonsense and misinformation. And if you would like a wonderful response to his book, Tom Stark wrote a wonderful response, Is God a Moral Compromiser? A critical review of Paul Copan's Is God a Moral Monster? And this second expanded and revised edition is freely available online. You can just Google the title.
And I think this is true about the questions we have to deal with, Charlie, on a college campus. People say, what are the hardest questions to answer? And I think the hardest questions to answer are none of them. They're just hard to answer in 2 minutes.
It take time to explain.
It takes time, a lot of context.
Yes, misleading people, lying about what's in the Bible, and ginning up imaginary scenarios to make quite clear and explicit moral evils sound less evil takes more than 2 minutes.
But we also must be unafraid to brag on how the teachings of the New Testament led to the abolition of slavery.
Yes.
No, that's not what happened. What happened is that European Christians in the Renaissance recovered classical philosophical inquiry thanks to its preservation among non-Christian traditions like Islam and Judaism, and concerns for natural law and for universal human rights and dignity, which originated in Stoic philosophical inquiry, were supplemented by texts like Genesis 1:27 and others, and that led to more and more Christians interpreting their experiences with the brutalities and the abuses of the practice of enslavement as an indication that slavery was a moral evil. And so it was primarily classical philosophical inquiry during the Reformation, during the Enlightenment, that led to Christians deciding this is a bad thing. And there were a lot of non-Christian groups involved in further promoting abolitionism. And for the best discussion of this history, as well as how apologists and Bible scholars obscure and misrepresent it, Hector Avalos's book, Slavery, Abolitionism, and the Ethics of Biblical Scholarship, is a wonderful discussion.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I mean, in Philemon, like 1:16, Paul writes to Philemon, you should view your slave as as an equal, basically.
That's right.
If I'm remembering correctly.
Yes. Philemon only has one chapter, so it's Philemon 16.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So there's absolutely nothing in the letter of Philemon that in any way, shape, or form necessarily questions, undermines, or condemns the practice itself of buying, selling, or owning other humans. It just advocates for better treatment of an enslaved Christian. And what we think might constitute better treatment of an enslaved Christian doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what Paul meant or with the way that text was interpreted by other Christians. Because we can go look in Augustine, who's writing toward the end of the 4th century CE, who's saying that God is angry with you if you do not whip your slaves when they misbehave. God just expects you to do it with love in your heart. So we would not understand that to be the kind of treatment that Paul was talking about. But for early Christians, that's precisely the kind of treatment Paul was talking about. There would not be a reinterpretation of Philemon as questioning, condemning, or undermining the practice itself of buying, selling, and owning other human beings until it first started out among Quakers and then Congregationalists toward the end of the 16th century, and then spread further in the 17th and 18th centuries and reached a critical mass toward the end of the 19th century. I think Lightfoot's Philemon commentary in 1875 is one of the main pivots toward the more widespread interpretation of Philemon as a rejection of slavery. There's a reason it took more than 1,500 years for people to decide to interpret it that way. And that's precisely because of the process I described, which begins with the recovery of classical philosophical inquiry and then combines with personal experiences and then reaches to the scriptures as the proof texts for the new ideologies that were formed by other influences but then needed some kind of authority, some kind of trump card, so that the challenges of other folks could be overruled. The process of renegotiating the nature of slavery with the Bible was a very long-term one.
Slavery has been the norm for almost every civilization.
Yes.
It is what worldview has gotten rid of it, which is noteworthy.
Exactly. And also, Jesus came to set the captives free. That was his initial inauguration. His inauguration in the ministry is Luke chapter 4. One of the things he says is, I came to set the captives free. But people will say, well, why didn't the New Testament tell that culture to eradicate slavery completely right then and there? Let me ask you a question about this, Charlie. See if you agree with this. Would it make any sense to tell people in California right now, particularly the minority of Christians, to eradicate abortion in California right now?
Would I tell them to?
But could they do it?
No.
They couldn't do it,
No.
right?
So here is the selective and fallacious yet inevitable apologetic retreat to naturalism, where naturalism serves apologetic interests. Because when we look in the Bible, there's never a time when God says, well, I want to overcome this evil among my people, but it might not work because of social pressure, so I'll just let it go. Usually it is God cannot tolerate sin or evil. And in the Bible, there's nothing off the table when it's time to overcome evil or sin. Sending a worldwide flood on the table, splitting the Red Sea on the table, killing all the firstborn children of Egypt and turning the river to blood on the table, killing 185,000 Assyrian troops to protect the city of Jerusalem from Sennacherib's siege on the table, demanding that Israel not even count the number of fighting men that they have, but rather trusting blindly in God's protection in the face of invasion on the table. So the Bible does not know of a God who sits there and hems and haws because this might not be socially viable. But additionally, this is a false analogy. The minority of Christians trying to outlaw abortion in all of California is not comparable to telling Christians that they themselves should not own slaves. The question isn't, why doesn't God have Christians abolish slavery throughout the Roman Empire? It's, why doesn't God just tell Christians, hey, you shouldn't own slaves because that's wrong? This is laughable rhetorical deflection from the actual concern that must retreat to laughable inconsistency and hypocrisy. God is not supposed to be tolerating evil. But if this argument about slavery is right, God spent thousands of years tolerating evil, only for people to begin to note that there might be something wrong with this because of Greek philosophy and because of their own experiences. That's the real catalyst for abolitionism. It's not this seed planted in Philemon that wouldn't even start to germinate for 1,500 years. I mean, that's just asinine.
What would be a way they could do it?
Incrementalism.
They could incrementally work
This
to
is Dennis
change the
Prager's
hearts
argument.
and minds.
This is the least persuasive argument to a college kid. 'Cause
oh,
they're-
it totally is.
Don't you agree? Incrementalism, they're like,
Totally.
how dare you?
Yeah.
Because they're 19 and they're zealots and they're self-righteous.
Uh-huh.
Yes, none of that at all characterizes Christian apologists, but incrementalism is nowhere to be found in the Bible. There's not a single syllable that in any way, shape, or form whatsoever questions, undermines, or condemns the practice itself of buying, selling, and owning other human beings. Again, over 1,500 years after the Bible was completed, people had to combine Stoic ideas about universal human rights with their experiences with the brutalities and the abuses of enslavement in order to impose a new interpretive lens on the Bible and negotiate a different reading out of it. That's not incrementalism. That's just renegotiating what we find in the Bible in light of contemporary social and historical circumstances.
And so I would say that incrementalism, would you agree, is the least persuasive
Oh,
argument?
it's the least persuasive, but it makes sense because of the political realities at the time. In fact, as you pointed out, it was universal. Slavery was everywhere in the ancient world. Now, by the time you got to the Roman period, it wasn't totally indentured servitude, but it wasn't completely chattel slavery either, because in the Roman period, it wasn't race-based, and you could buy your way out of it. Okay, so it wasn't like we had here, but it was still something that was not ideal, quite obviously. And God, the way he got rid of it was through incrementally. First of all, everyone's made in the image of God. Everybody is one in Christ. There are no social distinctions.
So these are the two passages that were not interpreted as undermining the practice of slavery until 1,500 years after the New Testament. That is not God hiding this ticking time bomb of abolition in the text. That is changing circumstances resulting in a renegotiation of what the text is going to mean to us. And that is how texts work. This is not because it was there all along. It's not because the author ever intended it. It's not because there's some magical puppet master hiding it in the text. It's because we changed our way of thinking and we decided to overrule what was in the text and interpret it an entirely different way.
Do you know that Pliny the Younger, who was somebody that persecuted Christians, said he tortured 2 slave women who were deaconesses in the church? How did slave women become deaconesses in the church? Because the church treated them as equals.
Well, for a few centuries, and then once the Roman Empire got involved, the patriarchy took over, and now we have people saying that women not only can't hold ecclesiastical office, they shouldn't even be allowed to vote. So, yeah, Christianity doesn't have a good track record here.
What do you say to the argument, and I'm paraphrasing, and I can look it up here, where Paul says you slaves should submit to their masters?
Yes.
How do we work through that?
Because what Christians are supposed to do is treat everyone as if they're made in the image of God, because they are. It is our way of loving people, even those who don't treat us well. We treat everybody like they're made in the image of God. So if you're in a slave situation, and Paul says try to get out of it if you can, but if you're in a slave situation...
He does say that.
Yes.
So this is a reference to 1 Corinthians 7:21, which is part of Paul's counsel to the people who fully expected Jesus to be coming back any day now, that they not change whatever life circumstances they were in when they were called by God. This is not universalizable counsel. This is Paul saying Jesus will be here any minute now. If you have a job, don't change your job. If you don't have kids, don't get pregnant. Don't change your life circumstances. And then the one thing that could be interpreted as an exception, the Greek is actually not perfectly clear, is the part where it says something about having an opportunity to leave slavery, but then Paul telling them freedom in Christ or enslavement to Christ is better than any kind of human freedom. So it's not clear exactly what's going on with verse 21 in particular, but what is very clear is that this is counsel Paul is giving to people who fully expect Jesus to be coming back so soon that they don't even have time to worry about changing jobs or getting pregnant, which is not really relevant to the numerous generations that lived and died after this generation Paul is talking to lived and died without seeing Jesus coming back.
You ought to do right by the person you're dealing with. In fact, Peter says this. He says, what good is it if you treat people well who treat you well? Even the pagans do that. He said, but you should treat people who don't treat you well.
Yes.
It's better to suffer evil than to do evil.
While the first letter of Peter, which was not written by Peter, does say to respond to evil with good, the statement that even pagans treat the ones who treat them well, that is actually Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount.
So they also say in slavery, and then this is a moral pomposity, kind of, they say that if the Bible is perfect, like, why didn't it explicitly say we got to get rid of this thing?
Well, it did, but in a way that wouldn't have crushed it at its initiation. Because if the Christian church had all these commands for the people at the time to overthrow the Roman government, they would have completely crushed the Christian church.
So let's take note of this absolutely asinine straw man. Because nobody is coming up to Charlie Kirk on college campuses and saying, if the Bible's perfect, how come it doesn't command Christians go overthrow the Roman government so they can obliterate the practice of slavery in the Greco-Roman world? Nobody is asking Charlie Kirk that. They're asking Charlie Kirk, if the Bible is perfect, why doesn't it identify slavery as evil and command Christians to stop practicing slavery? And we've got a bunch of other comparable issues. The Bible repeatedly tells Christians not to eat foods sacrificed to idols. The Bible nowhere tells Christians they have to go overthrow the Roman government so that they can obliterate the practice of eating foods sacrificed to idols. It's not about entirely obliterating this, requiring the overthrowing of the Roman government. It's about identifying this as evil and telling Christians they shouldn't be doing it. But there's absolutely no case to make whatsoever that the Bible is right in not telling Christians that this is evil and they shouldn't be practicing it. So Frank has to address this asinine straw man, as if the question is, why doesn't the Bible tell Christians to go overthrow the Roman government? That's absolutely not the question, and that is an absolutely asinine straw man.
So what they said was, you can't kidnap anybody, that everybody, regardless of their social position, is an equal, that
They get a Sabbath.
They get a Sabbath, they have rights. If you hurt a slave, they go free. If you kill a slave, you're going to be punished.
So notice not a single thing that Frank is saying here actually constitutes a condemnation or an undermining or even a questioning of the practice itself of buying, selling, and owning other human beings. This is not incrementally moving towards abolishing slavery. This is just advocating for a more benevolent slavery. And Frank has to actually misrepresent what the texts say in order to make it sound like it's actually a more benevolent slavery. If you hurt a slave, they go free. No, that's not anywhere in the Bible. What is in the Bible is if you knock out a slave's eye or tooth, they go free in one part of the Bible, but again, that probably was never enforced. The notion that if you kill a slave, you'll be punished, that's also a misrepresentation of what's going on in the very same chapter, where it actually says if a master beats a slave with a stick and he dies immediately, then there will be punishment. But if the slave survives for a couple of days and then dies, there's no punishment at all. And the idea there is that if the beating resulted in the immediate death of the slave, then that's clearly intent to kill. But if it was a discipline that accidentally resulted in the slave's death, because it took a couple days for the slave to pass away, then that was obviously not with the intent to kill. And there is no punishment whatsoever. If you beat a free person with a stick and they die a couple days later, you get punished, which shows that the slave did not have remotely the same rights. Their life was not worth the same as a free-born person. And we can even look in the pre-Civil War American South. There were laws on the books that prohibited beating a slave in a way that maimed them or resulted in their death. So going back to the apples and oranges, comparing what actually happened on the ground in America to what's on the books in the Bible, we can see that even America in the pre-Civil War American South had laws on the books that did the same kind of things that the laws on the books in the Bible were supposed to be doing. And just like the laws on the books in the pre-Civil War American South, the laws on the books in the Bible probably were not enforced.
So the slaves weren't property, although when you read in the Old Testament, you'll hear them referred to as property. What that meant was they were money. It's equivalent today to say, well, let me ask you this. Can the owner of the Golden State Warriors sell Steph Curry?
Yes.
Yes, he can, because he owns the basketball services of Steph Curry.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah. But he can't sell Steph Curry as a person.
Yep.
He can. Steph Curry is under
services,
contract,
yep.
The services. This is the language that was used in the Bible. It wasn't the kind of language that chattel slavery used. It was the kind of language that we might relate to a sports team, a sports owner. You own the services of Steph Curry, but you don't own him as a person.
This is the most asinine false analogy. No, it does not suggest that an enslaved person's services were the property. Because when it says money, Frank's actually referring to a specific passage in Exodus 21. That passage where it talks about beating a slave with a stick, where if he dies immediately, then the slave will be avenged. But if he dies after a couple of days, then there's no punishment because he was his kesef, which means silver, which means money, which meant property. So it's not identifying the slave's services as the money of the master. It's identifying the slave's body, the slave as his property, and his death is punishment enough because he no longer has access to that slave and his body. If the reference to the slave as his kesef, as his silver, as his money meant his services and not his body and his person, then that manslaughter would have resulted in some kind of punishment rather than resulted in absolutely no punishment whatsoever. And when we go to Leviticus 25, 44 through 46, where it says they can be bought and sold, enslaved forever, passed on as inheritance because they are achuzah, which is not kesef, which is not the word for money. Achuzah means possession, property. That's chattel slavery, and the comparison with multimillionaire athletes today is so profoundly asinine. There's no comparison whatsoever. That is entirely a false analogy.
So on the slavery question, then, they would also say, why are there so many laws that make it seem like it's okay, that doesn't forbid it?
Because it's case law, just like we have in the United States, where it'll say in the Old Testament, if a man hits his slave and causes damage, then there'll be a penalty to the man. But that case law isn't prescribing that you hit your slave. Mm-hmm. It's describing what you should do if someone hits their slave. Much like we have laws today. If somebody breaks into a house and steals something, what should you do to them? It's not prescribing breaking into houses and stealing. It's telling you what to do when somebody does evil.
Another absolutely asinine false analogy, because the Bible absolutely prescribes slavery. In Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46, it says, "And the male and female slaves that belong to you from the nations that surround you, from them you will purchase your male and female slaves." And then it goes on to describe them as chattel slaves, as your property to buy, to sell, to enslave forever, to pass down as inheritance. So if we use this analogy of case law involving breaking and entering, Leviticus 25:44 through 46 would be the commandment that says, as for breaking into houses, you will break into the houses of the foreigners who live around you. So yes, it absolutely condones, endorses, prescribes slavery, a specific type of slavery. It's saying this type of chattel slavery is only to be practiced with the foreigners, the people around you, the foreigners who are dwelling among you, selling you their enslaved people, their children, their wives. It's absolutely saying that it is entirely okay. And the notion that this is case law, that is just referring to what happens when something happens to a slave without actually suggesting that the practice of buying, selling, and owning slaves is not explicitly condoned and even endorsed, is just laughably false. That's just not true at all. This is remarkably ignorant, remarkably naive, and remarkably misleading. Frank either doesn't have a clue what the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament has to say about slavery, or he's just flatly misrepresenting it and knows that he is flatly misrepresenting it. I don't know which it is, but these apologetic arguments are just laughable. And people really need to grow the hell up and stop appealing to such juvenile and asinine rationalizations for the Bible's endorsement and condoning and prescribing of slavery. And the fit for this video is Micah 6:8.